The standards, certificates, and policies that decide who is recognized, who is trusted, and who is refused. This is the identity layer. Welcome back to the identity layer. I'm Tunji, and this is episode 4. Today, we're talking about digital identity in the global south. Now, 800 million people on this planet cannot prove who they are. It's not because they don't exist. Most of them were recorded at birth, in a ledger, or by hand. They just can't prove it at a counter where it actually counts. And here's the twist. Some of the most advanced identity thinking in the world right now is coming from exactly these countries. So forget the story you've been told. Let's get into it. And I actually want to be absolutely clear with you. This episode is certainly not an appeal. It's not a charity appeal. It's not a story about places that are behind, waiting patiently for the rest of the world to arrive. Parts of this story are ahead of anything running in Brussels or Washington. And I will show you exactly where it starts, where the break is, in the chain is. And it's a break in a chain that most of us never think about. So here is the chain. You are born. Your birth is registered. A certificate is issued. That certificate gets you a national identity later in life. And that identity gets you everything else: banking, school enrollment, a SIM card, a vote. It is a chain, and that word matters because everything else downstream of a break inherits the break. And the break is right in front. 150 million children under the age of 5 are unregistered. No record at all. And here is the number that should really stop you. 50 million more were registered. The event was recorded, and they still have no certificates to show for it. The state does know that they exist, they just can't prove it. So, the questions for this episode are simple to ask, but uncomfortable to answer. Who gets to prove who they are? And who quietly is left out? No dramatically excluded, not turned away at the border with cameras rolling. Quietly. And at the counter, in a queue, one form at a time. Now, every identity system has two parts. There is a system that one sees, the shiny enrollment centers, the biometric enrollment centers, the biometric kits, the cards, the apps, the ministerial launch with the ribbon. And there is the register that nobody funds, civil registration. The ledger of births and deaths that everyone else stands on. The system that gets the procurement budget, the press coverage, and the vendor attention. The foundation gets whatever is left. And every engineer watching this already knows what happens to a building where the foundation got whatever was left over. So, the problem. What exactly is the problem? It's not a technology gap, it's a registration gap. And to make it concrete, I want to tell you about one particular woman because statistics do not queue at counters. People do. So let's call her Amaka. In some languages, maybe called Grace, but let's call her Amaka. She's born in a rural clinic. The clinic writes her name in a ledger. That ledger entry is real. It exists. A nurse wrote it by hand on the day she was born. But the walk to the registration office today is a full day. The certificate carries a fee her family cannot spare that season. And so her certificate is never collected. The record does exist, the proof does not. Now, 18 years later, Amaka stands in an enrollment center for the new national identity. Modern kit, fingerprint scanners, a camera at hand, and the officer asks her for the one thing the Chinese new system was built to assume: a birth certificate. In other parlance, we call that a breeder document. She doesn't have one. She never did. 18 years apart. Both times, a register knew her name. Neither time could she prove it at the counter. The same woman recorded twice, documented never. That is the registration gap. And I want you to hold Amaka in your mind for the next half hour. Because every system we look at today either works for her or it does not work at all. So let's look at the potential solution. Because for me, every problem has a solution. The problem is finding the solution. Now, so the thesis for this episode is one sentence: fund the register, not just the system. Every dollar spent on a gleaming identity platform built on top of a broken civil register is a dollar spent painting the upstairs of a house with cracked foundations. Now, let's keep that sentence because everything else today is evidence for it. What actually is being built? Now, the part of the story the commentary keeps missing is this. While the conference circuit debates wallet architectures, the global south has been enrolling people at scale that Europe has never attempted. MOSIP, the open source identity platform born at a research institute in Bangalore in India, reported that at MOSIP Connect in Rabat this February, that 185 million identities were issued across 29 countries. Let me repeat that. 185 million in 29 countries. That is not a pilot. It's certainly not a sandbox. That is more issued digital identities than the entire population of most G7 countries running on open source rails in countries that the industry keeps describing as recipients of technologies rather than operators of it. So, no, not behind, ahead in places. The interesting question is not whether these countries can build identity systems. They already demonstrably can and do. The question is what gets built, who locks it in, and who falls out of it, which brings us now to the funnel. So, enrollment is not exactly one hurdle, it is 5 in sequence, and you have to clear all of them. Let's look at stage 1. Does Amaka even know that the program exists? Awareness is certainly not free. It has to be bought in radio time and community outreach. Now, it's also usually the first line that is cut from the budget. Stage 2. Can she reach the office itself? The World Bank data puts distance amongst one of the top barriers. For around 42% of unregistered adults in low-income countries, the office is simply too far. Stage 3, can she produce the documents? The breeder's documents, the certificate Amaka never had. Roughly 41% cite exactly this: no breeder documents. Stage 4, can she afford the fee? 39% say cost. And remember, these barriers stack. Plenty of people face all three at once. Then there's stage 5, the one that nobody budgets for. Can her biometrics actually be read? Every single time for years. Not once at enrollment, but every time, every authentication for the rest of her natural life. Now, every stage loses people. And here is the sentence that should be pinned above every program director's desk. It loses the same people. The woman who did not hear about it is the woman who lives farthest from the office, who has no certificate, who cannot spare the fee, whose hands are worn from farm work. Exclusion compounds. It's the same face at the bottom of every funnel. Now, let's look at and talk about how these systems get bought. because this is where the global south actually pays twice. Vendor lock-in is not an accident that happens to a particular country. It is a procurement outcome decided on the day that the contract is signed in clauses that nobody flags. Now, I'll be honest with you, it's actually changing nowadays. Vendor lock-in isn't something that we really worry too much about. But the vendors that try it, they do try their best to get this going. Proprietary templates, template formats. So your citizen fingerprints are stored in a shape that can only be read by one vendor. Oh, they cite proprietary claims and all whatnot. Close matching engines so that you cannot benchmark at the error rates that you're actually paying for. Per transaction licensing, so your own population's daily life becomes somebody else's recurring revenue. Unfortunately, it's been a model for so many companies that tout their ways to the global south for decades. You have undocumented schemas. So migration is a rebuild. If you're moving from one platform to another, it's a totally different system altogether. None of that appears in the technical evaluation. All of it is decided absolutely there. What is the countermeasure? The countermeasure has a boring name and dramatic consequences: modularity. Registration, matching, issuance, and authentication are separate modules, talking to each other through an open, documented interface or interfaces. And understand what modularity actually is for. It's not an architecture diagram aesthetic. What modularity actually buys concretely is the ability to fire your vendor without having to rebuild your country. That's the whole point. Interfaces are exactly the product. I'm Tunji Drodola. I spent over 2 decades inside these systems, building them, breaking them, and sitting on buyer side of the table, reading those procurement clauses. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the identity layer. And you'll find everything that we do at the identity layer substack.com and on YouTube at identity layer. Please join us. Subscribe to the like button below and join us for the full package, because at Substack, we try to have essays that we can share with you, documents that you can review, diagrams that you can critique and look at, because I strongly believe that diagrams, they carry more than actual words to carry them along. For over 2 decades, Iris Smart Technologies has been behind the scenes, building the technology that powers some of Nigeria's most critical systems, from secure government-grade identity solutions to biometric enrollment and national ID platforms. Iris Smart is helping organizations get identity right and at scale. But they don't stop there. They also design custom software and mobile apps for Android and iOS. They manage secure, high-performance data centers and bring complex systems together into one seamless and reliable environment. So, whether it's a national rollout or a tailored enterprise solution, Iris Smart Technologies partners with you from strategy to deployment and stays with you to keep everything running smoothly. Over 2 decades, one commitment: technology that transforms. Iris Smart Technologies, real technology, real impact. Visit irissmart.com. Now, back to the topic. Let's zoom back out, because the stakes have changed under our feet. Digital identity is no longer a background process. It is becoming infrastructure in the full sense of that word. It sits beneath banking, travel, healthcare, education, government services, employment, telecoms, and everyday access to the digital economy. When something becomes infrastructure, Being outside it stops being an inconvenience and starts being a wall. Now, our industry loves the metaphor of the door. Digital identity as the door to services, and our job is to open it wider. But here is the question this episode exists to ask. What if that door was never built? 800 million people have absolutely no proof of identity whatsoever. And 2.8 billion more have some form of identity, but they cannot prove it online. Which, in an economy that is moving online, rounds the same wall. That is not an edge case population. That is a third of humanity standing where a door was supposed to be. So, what is this wall actually made of? Not cryptography. The three barriers that in the World Bank's own data are distance, documents, and cost. Now, that is the list. Now, when we look at where this industry spends its engineering effort, selective disclosure protocols, zero knowledge proofs, credential format wars, I actually enjoy that it works as much as anyone, but some of it matters enormously. And a perfectly implemented credential standard moves none of the three. You cannot cryptographically shorten the road to the registration office. The question is this: what does moving the barriers actually look like? The best answer in production is anywhere is graduated assurance, and it comes from the Global South mobile money experience, not from standard bodies. It works like a ladder. No documents at all, you can still get a wallet, capped and domestic only. A verified number, well, a higher cap. One document, more gain. Full identity, then the caps come off. Nobody is excluded at the door. You are always on somebody's ladder somewhere, and the system gives you a perfect reason to climb. Think about what that means for Amaka. Under the traditional model, she is nothing more than until the program reaches her district, and then still nothing until she finds a certificate that she never had. Under graduated assurance, she is a customer today, capped, limited, but inside the system, building a record. This is actually a system that is working, especially in various countries in Africa. Graduated assurance, in my personal view, is the single most undercopied idea in this entire field. And the places copying it are the places at the least places lecturing the most. So, meanwhile, the penalty for being outside keeps rising. Among the people without an ID, 43% report difficulty in getting a SIM card, 37% in difficulty in voting, 26% problems accessing medical care. And watch the trend, not just this level. That same figure is up 4.5 points since 2021. Every year, more services demand verified identity. So, every year, the cost of not having one goes up. Exclusion is not a static condition. It is a debt with compounding interest. Let's look at this slide. Let's correct a notion to a lazy conclusion. If a proprietary lock-in is the villain, open source must be the free lunch, right? I don't think so. For many years, I've actually been a proponent of open source. In fact, my nickname is the Linux Prophet. But I'll be realistic here. Open source is not free. The license is free, but the implementation is not. Somebody still has to integrate it, secure it, operate it around the clock, patch it, and the hardest of all, keep the skills in the country. After the launch, consultants have already flown home. An open source system runs entirely by foreign contractors is still an open is still looking with better branding. Let me repeat that. If you have an open source model that you've deployed in a country, but you're still dependent on foreigners to come into your country to make it work and to sustain it and to maintain it, then it is just another vendor with different branding. That is the way that I take a look at it. The license solves the procurement problem, but local capability solves the sovereignty problem. And one more stake, the most physical one. Fingerprints do wear out. Manual work, farm work, fishing, construction, laundry, they all erode rigid detail year after year, which produces the cruelest failure mode in this entire field. The most people likely to fail biometrics authentication are precisely the people most likely to need the benefits that authentication gates: the pension, the food subsidy, the health entitlement. This is not an edge case. It is at national scale, it is a city's worth of people. And the fix is not clever threshold on the matchup. The fix is multimodal capture. In other words, where you have face, iris, alongside fingerprints. Those are different modalities. And a funded, staffed exception path for when the machine says no to a real person. So if fingerprints fail, you should be able to turn to either face or iris. If the exception desk is not in the budget, the exclusion is. Now for a segment, understanding the tech. Now, there are 8 terms that are used in this particular episode. 8 pieces of vocabulary. Once you have them, let you read any identity program announcement and see exactly what is being said. So we're trying to interpret the technobabble in plain language with an analogy for each. The first, CRVS, Civil Registration and Vital Statistics. Now let's take away the acronym and look at exactly what it means. It's basically a birth and death register. The state's ledger of who exists. It is a layer of every identity system that is built on. And as we've seen throughout the episode, the one that never gets the budget because there's no ribbon to cut in front of a ledger. Let's use an analogy. It's the foundations of a house. Nobody photographs the foundations. Nobody funds them either. And everything above them cracks when they fail. So in other words, if you have a very poor foundation, that house is not going to sit very long. When you hear a country announce a gleaming new, shiny digital ID, your first question now is this: what state is the CRVS underneath it? What is the state of that particular system? Second, breeder document. Now, I know that this is a bit of an odd term, but it is very precise. It is a document that lets you obtain other documents, usually your birth certificate. Your passport was bred from it. Your national ID was bred from it. Every credential you hold traces back to its ancestry, back to that one piece of paper. Break it, and everything downstream breaks with it, which is exactly what happened to Amaka at the enrollment center. Let's look at an analogy: the seed. Everything in your documentary life grows from it. Without it, the paperwork has nowhere to start. And it also explains why fraud concentrates there. Forge the seeds, and the system itself grows into a genuine tree. Now, let's look at foundational versus functional identity. A foundational identity proves who you are in general for any purpose. I'll give you a few examples. In Nigeria, the foundational identity is called the National Identification Number, or NIN. In the United States, it is the Social Security Number. In the United Kingdom, The identifier is usually called it's also NIN, but it's national insurance number. And there are many others like that. So a functional identity proves who you are for one service only. So that could be I'll use Nigeria again as an instance. Your BVN or bank verification number is used in the financial sector. You can have a TIN, which is your tax identification number. You can have an HIN or health insurance number, and so on and so forth. You can't use a health insurance number to open a bank account. You cannot use your tax ID number when you fall ill in a hospital. Neither is wrong. They are just different tools. So the best instance is that these functional IDs cannot be used interchangeably, which is why they are designed for specific purposes. You can't use your passport, for example, as a library card, and you cannot use a library card to travel. The library card will get you books and nothing else, and you certainly cannot use it to travel internationally. So that's that particular analogy. Let's look at the next one: ABIS and deduplication. ABIS stands for the Automated Biometrics Identification System. It's a system that a lot of countries use to uh, enroll citizens. So when you enroll, your fingerprints, your face, and iris are not just stored. They actually search against every record. You do one-to-many matching to make sure that you don't actually already exist in the database. So the question is this: is this person already here under a different name? And that search is called deduplication. And it is what makes an identity list a register rather than just a guest book. So note the precision. An ABIS system is a component of an identity system. It is not a synonym for one, whatever the vendor slide may imply. Let's use an analogy. A bouncer may have a very long memory. A bouncer may be good at spotting a returning face, but not at a national scale. Even a tiny error rate is a city's worth of people wrongly turned away, which is why the appeals desk next to the bouncer matter as much as the bouncer. Brownfield implementation. Greenfield means building on an empty field, no legacy, no constraints. Brownfield means modernizing a national identity system that already exists, with live data, live dependencies, and citizens using it every day. It is much harder than Greenfield, and it's much more common than most vendor slides suggest. Some of them will actually suggest you get rid of the old system and bring in theirs, but that really is not the best way to go for it unless you have some critical flaws in the foundation system that you're inheriting. So the global south has a lot of these kind of challenges. Let's look at an analogy. It's like wiring a house while the family is still in it. You can't turn the power off because the family still needs to cook dinner and the old wiring is not documented. Now, Uganda, for example, migrated 30 million biometric records exactly this way. When it goes well, nobody notices, which is why it is not properly funded by entities. Interoperability profile. Now, we make this much earlier on, and here's the title version. A profile is a subset and interpretation of a base standard that a jurisdiction actually implements. Here's the trap. Two systems can genuinely both conform to the same standard and still fail to talk to each other because they conform to different profiles of it. We touched on interoperability and trust in episodes 1 and 2. Now, look at this analogy. Two people speaking English, one in Lagos and one in Glasgow, or let me use an Aberdeen. So I'll give you an example. A person in Aberdeen may say to another, fit like. Now, to the other person in Aberdeen, that person is speaking a dialect of English and he says, oh, neighbor. But somebody who is coming from Lagos in Nigeria and lands in Aberdeen, and somebody says fit like to him, he probably won't understand what he's saying. Conversely, as well, in pidgin English, you say, oh boy, how body? The person will likely reply, not bad. But if you go to Aberdeen or Glasgow and say the same thing, the person probably won't understand what you mean. So this is where interoperability, you may have a challenge because both of them will say they're speaking English, but they're dialects of English, which one may not understand the other. OSIA. This is the Open Standards Identities API. Now, full disclosure, I actually am a member of the Secure Identity Alliance. I'm not here to promote the SIA or the or OSIA, but we're just going to mention it here because this information is available online. It standardizes interfaces. OSIA standardizes interfaces between the components of an identity system: registration, ABIS, issuance, authentication, and so on, so that any module can be replaced without replacing the whole system. So in other words, if you're not happy with a particular vendor who has implemented the civic register, for example, you can replace it with another vendor that is OSIA compliant, something like that. You don't care who made the kettle, for example. You just need, you bought one kettle, it broke down, or you're not happy with it. You go to a shop, you buy another model that is properly marketed. All you just do is plug it into the wall, put in water, and it works. So OSIA is what turns modular from a marketing word into a contractual fact. And that is the difference between being able to change a supplier just rather than just being told that you can. So this is the last one, DPI, Digital Public Infrastructure. The idea of treating identity, payments, and data exchange as shared national rails, the way roads and power lines are, rather than products that are bought per ministry. It is also, right now, the term that unlocks multilateral funding, which is why it is suddenly on every slide. Let's look at an analogy. Roads and power lines for the digital state, genuinely useful and worth remembering that adopting the term commits you to an architecture as well as a check. Always they examine the two separately. Always. That's the end of this segment for today. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been watching the identity layer. This is the identity layer. Thanks for watching. If this was useful, hit the subscribe button below. It generally helps the show to reach the people who build these systems. And the full technical write-up with diagrams, architecture, and the sources is available on our Substack at identitylayer.substack.com. Again, identitylayer.substack.com. Join us there and see you next time.